The first thing I saw after waking up in that hospital bed wasn't my daughter. It wasn't a nurse. It was the empty mark on my finger where my wedding ring should have been. That ring had been on my hand for 38 years. 3 days later, I learned my own daughter had sold it while I was lying in that hospital, believing I'd never discover the truth. But she forgot one thing. The man who owned the pawn shop knew exactly what that ring meant to me. If you've ever had someone you trusted break your heart, you're going to understand this story. And if stories about family, hard lessons, and unexpected justice mean something to you, I'd love for you to subscribe to Family Betrayal before we go any further. Also, the faces, photos, and scenes you see in this video are only there to help tell the story. They're not real images of the people involved. My name is Daniel. I'm 64 years old, and until that week, I honestly believed my daughter Emily would always protect what mattered most to our family. My wife, Sarah, passed away 6 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Before she died, she held my hand and smiled through the pain. She touched my wedding ring and whispered, "Promise me you'll never take it off unless you're putting it into one of our grandchildren's hands someday." I made that promise without thinking twice. That ring wasn't expensive. The gold was worn smooth from decades of work, and there was a tiny scratch across the top from the day we bought our first house together. To anyone else, it was just an old ring. To me, it was my entire marriage. A month before everything fell apart, I suffered a mild stroke while mowing my lawn. My neighbor found me and called 911. The doctors told me I'd recover, but I needed several days in the hospital for tests. Emily visited the first evening with flowers and a worried smile. She kissed my forehead, held my hand, and told every nurse she would take care of everything back home. Looking into her eyes, I believed every word. I had no idea she was already making decisions that would change our relationship forever. And the phone call waiting for me after I left that hospital would prove that betrayal sometimes wears the face you love the most. The day I was discharged, I was exhausted. Every step hurt, but I was grateful to be going home. Emily insisted on driving me. She smiled the whole ride, talking about my medications, doctor's appointments, and how she'd clean the house while I was gone. She sounded like the perfect daughter. Then I walked into my bedroom. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it at first. Everything looked neat, almost too neat. My dresser drawers had been rearranged. The small wooden jewelry box Sarah had owned sat in a different spot. When I opened it, my heart skipped a beat. My wedding ring was gone. I searched every drawer, every shelf, every jacket pocket. I even looked in places I knew I'd never leave it. Emily watched me from the doorway. "Dad, what are you looking for?" she asked. "My wedding ring." Her face didn't change. Maybe the hospital misplaced it. I wanted to believe her. After all, I'd been unconscious for part of my stay. Maybe someone had removed it before a scan. Maybe I had forgotten. The next morning I called the hospital. They checked every record. One nurse came back on the line and quietly said, "Mr. Carter, according to your admission paperwork, you were still wearing your wedding ring when your daughter signed your personal belongings out." My stomach dropped. Emily had collected my wallet, my watch, and my ring. When I confronted her that evening, she looked me straight in the eyes. "I don't know what they're talking about," she said without blinking. They must have made a mistake. I wanted to believe my own daughter more than I wanted the truth. Then, 2 days later, my phone rang. "Mr. Carter?" a calm older voice asked. "Yes. My name is Frank. I own Carter's Pawn and Jewelry downtown. I think I have something that belongs to you." Before I could answer, he quietly added, "Your daughter sold me your wedding ring." But I couldn't bring myself to melt it down. My knees nearly gave out. And what he told me next made me realize he had already set a plan in motion, one Emily never saw coming. I drove to the pawn shop the next morning with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. Frank met me at the counter before I even said a word. He reached beneath the glass case, placed a small black box in front of me, and slowly opened it. There it was, Sarah's ring. The tiny scratch from the day we bought our first house was still there. I picked it up, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt like I could breathe again. Frank sighed. "Your daughter said you'd passed away, and she was selling a few things to cover funeral expenses." I believed her at first, but then I recognized you from the neighborhood. Something didn't sit right, so I decided to hold on to the ring instead of putting it up for sale. I closed my eyes. My own daughter had told a complete stranger I was dead. "There's something else," Frank said. "She called yesterday. She sounded nervous. She asked if she could buy the ring back today." I told her to come in at noon. I looked at the clock. It was 11:40. Frank glanced at me. If you want answers, stay. For 20 long minutes, neither of us said much. My heart pounded every time the door opened. Then Emily walked in. She smiled as she approached the counter, pulling cash from her purse. "I'm here for the wedding ring," she said. Frank looked toward me without saying a word. Emily followed his eyes. The second she saw me standing there with the ring in my hand, every bit of color disappeared from her face. "Dad," she whispered. The excuses started immediately. She claimed she'd only borrowed the money. She insisted she planned to buy the ring back before I noticed. Then the truth finally slipped out. She had sold it to pay off thousands of dollars in secret gambling debts she'd been hiding for over a year. I stared at the daughter I thought I knew and realized the biggest betrayal wasn't losing the ring. It was discovering she'd been lying to me for far longer than I ever imagined. And what I decided to do next shocked everyone in that pawn shop. Emily stood there crying, waiting for me to yell, waiting for me to tell her she wasn't my daughter anymore. I won't pretend that thought didn't cross my mind. It did. I was hurt, angry, and embarrassed all at once. But underneath all of that was something even heavier. I realized I had been watching my daughter slowly fall apart without seeing the signs. She admitted she'd borrowed money from friends, maxed out credit cards, and started gambling online after losing her job. Every lie led to another until she convinced herself selling my wedding ring was the only way out. She kept telling herself she'd buy it back before I came home. Instead, she almost lost the one thing her mother had begged me to protect. I looked at Frank and thanked him for doing what a stranger didn't have to do. If he had stayed quiet, I might never have known the truth. Then I turned back to Emily. I told her I was taking the ring home with me, and she would never have access to it again. I also told her I wasn't giving her another dollar. If she wanted me in her life, she had to earn back my trust instead of asking for it. That meant counseling for her gambling addiction, complete honesty about every debt, and no more lies. If she refused, our relationship would end right there. She broke down in tears and agreed to every condition. The next year wasn't easy. There were difficult conversations, missed holidays, and days when I wondered if we would ever be a family again. But little by little, she changed. She found steady work, paid back what she owed, attended counseling, and stopped trying to hide from her mistakes. Trust didn't come back overnight. It returned one honest choice at a time. Today, my wedding ring rests in a small safe whenever I sleep, and every morning I still put it on my finger. It reminds me of Sarah's love, but it also reminds me that forgiveness isn't forgetting. Real forgiveness still requires accountability. I'm grateful Frank made that phone call, because he didn't just save a ring. He gave my daughter one last chance to save herself. So let me ask you this. If you were standing in my shoes, would you have forgiven her, or would that betrayal have been too much to come back from? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who believes family should be built on trust. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Family Betrayal for more emotional stories that remind us how fragile trust can be and how powerful the truth can become when it finally comes to light.